Hi everybody, welcome to our first part of the persuasive speaking lecture. This is going to be broken up into 2 or 3 pieces, so make sure that you watch them, and it's really important that you understand what is being addressed in each video before you move on to the next one, because they're going to build on each other. So this first video is really going to cover what a persuasive speech is, what are we trying to achieve with a persuasive speech, what's our objective, and most importantly, how to write a persuasive thesis statement. We engage in the act of persuasion all the time, day in and day out, when we try to get somebody to go someplace that we like to eat at, or we ask our roommates for their rent money or for their bill money, right? We are trying to get them to follow through with something. But even on a larger scale, in the way that we communicate with each other when we're talking about politics, ideology, culture, a show that we really like, our favorite foods, or arguing with somebody about something, we are typically engaging in some type of persuasion. And what you see on the first slide here is the definition of persuasion, and that is the art of convincing others to give favorable attention to our point of view. Now this is really important because it's not about some big grandiose thing about changing the way our audience fundamentally lives their life or thinks about something. All we're trying to do is get our audience to say, you know, I think that's pretty reasonable. And that's it. We're just trying to get our audience, whoever it is, whether it's a large auditorium or one individual person, we're just trying to get that person to give our ideas favorable attention, to say, yeah, you know what, that makes sense to me, and maybe I'll think about it a little bit more. If you get more than that, great, but that's not the goal. It really is just about convincing others to give favorable attention to our point of view. And that's what you're going to be doing in this particular speech. Now, the purpose of a persuasive speech is a little bit different than the definition, right? They're going to line up, but the purpose of a persuasive speech is to influence the beliefs, attitudes, values, and acts of others by getting them to give favorable attention to our point of view. If you think to the other types of speeches that we've done in the commemorative and then in the informative speech, we've had different purposes, different end goals, different objectives that we're trying to achieve. A commemorative speech, we're trying to get everybody on the same emotional level. In an informative speech, we are trying to teach our audience something. In our persuasive speech, we are trying to influence our audience's beliefs, attitudes, values, and acts by giving favorable attention to our audience's point of view. So moral of the story here, you are taking a stance and you're trying to get whoever it is that you're talking to take that stance with you, or at least acknowledge that you are taking a reasonable stance. And that really is it. And how far you go with that depends on a number of different things. And it starts with determining what your objective is. We have 2 different types of objectives, or 2 different functions of any persuasive speech. One is to convince, and this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a cognitive thing. We are trying to convince our audience that they should exercise more, that they should eat less sugar, that it's immoral to eat large portions of red meat that's produced by factory farming, that it is wrong to not vote or wrong to vote in a particular way, right? So we are trying to convince our audience of something, and it's a cognitive process. We just want our audience to think about it. These are going to be more of our values or our fact-based thesis statements. That'll make a little bit more sense in a minute. The second function is to actuate, and this is to encourage or achieve action. We are trying to alter our audience's behavior. We don't want them to just think it's a good idea to exercise more. We want our audience to actually exercise more. Whatever that looks like, it's up to you to determine in your argument and what you're saying. But there's a difference between thinking something is a good idea and actually doing that. We know that as individuals, right? We know that we can say, yeah, you know what? That's a good idea. But I'm still going to eat that cookie, even though I know I shouldn't. That's one of my biggest vices is sweets. So I know that I probably shouldn't eat as many sweets as I do. I've been convinced of that over and over again. I've accepted the logic. I understand the reasoning for it. But I still do it. And that is part of the trick of a speech to actuate versus a speech to convince. It is much more challenging to get our audience to actually put energy into doing something, whether it impacts them positive or negatively, human beings, we don't really like to change too much, especially when somebody else is asking us to do it. And there's a particular way to go about that. We're going to talk about how to use ethos, pathos, and logos to achieve those goals, but more importantly, we have to start thinking about what we really want to say. What are we trying to achieve? And that comes through the use of our thesis statements. So first and foremost, figure out what is your objective. Are you trying to convince your audience of something, or are you trying to actuate? Are you trying to get them to take action, to put physical energy into doing something? Once you determine that, now you need to decide what your thesis statement is going to be. We're going to have 3 different types of thesis statements, and you can think about them as statements of fact, propositions of fact, or questions of fact. For this particular assignment, they're not going to be questions because I'm requiring that you write a statement, right? So it's going to be a proposition or a statement of fact. That's the first one. Our second one is going to be value. Our third one is going to be policy. So statements of fact are true or false type statements. They're exactly what they sound like. Something is true, something is false. It either is or it isn't. And typically we don't really work with these. That's not how our day-to-day lives typically exist. There's always room for error. There's lots of gray area, even in science, even in statistics, even in mathematics. There's always room for error. So most of the time we talk about facts, we say, oh, that's a fact. When in reality it's not. It's typically a value statement, and that'll make more sense in a second. So here are some thesis statement examples. So the Earth is flat is one type of thesis statement example. The Earth is not perfectly round. Another type of fact-based thesis statement or statement of fact or proposition of fact. Number 3, a person will die of sleep deprivation faster than dying from dehydration. This is a statement of fact. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily true, but I'm framing it as a statement of fact. Last but not least, drinking too much water will kill a person. So what you can see here is that these are all written in a way that doesn't give a lot of room for flexibility. It either is or it is not. So your statements of fact are going to be just like that. Now a statement of value is where we get into the gray area. And this is the really important side of what we're doing because we're getting into the weeds. We're making statements about morals, ethics, values, right and wrong. So when we are doing this, we need to give an evaluation criteria. We have to say, what makes something better than something else? How do we know that? What makes something good or bad? What makes something right or wrong? We can call this degrees of freedom, but really you can just think about it as saying, here's how I'm evaluating this, and you should do this as well. And if you take those same evaluation criteria, evaluate the pros and cons of crunchy versus creamy peanut butter, you will come to agree with me that crunchy peanut butter is in fact better than creamy peanut butter. Even though I said fact, I'm making a statement of value. So here are some examples. Crunchy peanut butter is better than creamy peanut butter. We see there is better than. That tells us it's a value statement. There's room for error. The San Francisco Giants are better than the Dodgers. Again, that's not a fact. Depending on the evaluation criteria, there's an argument there depending on what side you agree with and what your evaluation criteria is. Recent history would show that that's actually not true if we were to look at it like a fact. Carrot cake is the best cake. Again, we have a value statement here. There is no right or wrong. I'm saying that this is the best cake. And here's my argument, and I would lay it out. It is immoral to eat meat. Again, we're talking about morals there. I have to tell you what it means for something to be moral or immoral. It is wrong to support factory farming. What does it mean for something to be wrong? I have to tell you that in my persuasive speech and in my argument. Next we have, it is better to buy actual leather as opposed to pleather or plastic leather. Again, I have to tell you what it makes it better than. So what you'll see here is in a fact-based statement, it's either one or the other, but with a value statement, there is room for error. There are degrees of freedom. We need to give some evaluation criteria. Lastly, we have statements of policy. Now, statements of policy call for behavior change. Now, this is going to directly relate to a speech that is trying to actuate, to encourage action. So when you're trying to convince, you're going to use a statement of fact or statement of value. When you're trying to actuate or actually get your audience to do something, you're going to use a statement of policy. This advocates for an appropriate or a specific course of action, and it is typically action or behavior driven. So I already answered your question here. It is to actuate. So if you're trying to actuate, you are in fact trying to get your audience to physically do something, and you would need to use a policy statement. Policy statements are always going to have the word should or should not. So when we say you should do something or you should not do something, you're making a policy statement. So think about it in your day-to-day life. When are you making a policy statement, and what are you trying to get your audience to do? Does it make sense? Are you trying to convince your audience by saying that they should do something? Well, we have a disconnect because we're trying to convince when this tries to actuate. And what you can do in your day-to-day life is create better arguments using these particular types of thesis statements. So here are some quick examples. People should shop at the farmer's market. You should stop eating so much meat that is produced by factory farming. People should get more involved in hunting their own meat. The government should force people to accept all scientific fact regardless of personal perspective. People should talk to strangers more. Now, obviously, that last one really is probably not a great idea given our current situation, but what you'll see through these examples is that they all say should or should not, and that tells us it is a policy statement. So this brings us to the end of our first persuasive lecture, and what we've gone over are the definitions, the purposes of persuasive speeches. We've gone over the objectives or the functions, which are to convince or to actuate. Remember, convince is cognitive, actuate is actually encouraging action. And then we've gone over the three different types of thesis statements. We have statements of fact, which are true or false, statements of value, which are more in that gray area, moral, immoral, ethical, unethical, right, wrong, better than. And then we have statements of policy. Statements of policy are behavior driven, and you will typically see somebody say should or should not. Now remember, statements of fact and of value relate to that function or that objective to convince, that cognitive process. Whereas a statement of policy is about behavior and actually changing action. That gets us to that function of actuate, where we're actually trying to encourage somebody to take action and to put their energy into something. That's going to wrap up this lecture. Please reach out to me if you have any questions about anything. Make sure you really understand these concepts before you move on to the next lecture, because it's going to build from this one. Take care, everybody.